Here is the takeaway. Unless the world changes course quickly and dramatically, the fundamental systems that support human civilization are at risk.
We're likely to see hundreds of millions of what we'll call environmental refugees.
As coastal communities like this one are at risk and in the worst case scenario could disappear altogether.
In the coming centuries, New York could be abandoned, its famous landmarks lost to the sea.
Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Miami, they would all be underwater.
That if the sea level rise occurred fast enough, some major cities might have to be abandoned, like for instance London.
This is about life or death.
It is a planetary emergency.
There is widespread scientific agreement that this is the most immediate threat to life as we know it.
Do you ever wonder how global warming became such an enormous crisis? Does it demand an immediate solution? Hi, I'm Mark Morano, and I certainly don't want to see parts of planet Earth submerged beneath the oceans or destroyed by horrific weather events. And I don't imagine you do either. But it all does seem a bit rushed, doesn't it? We repeatedly hear that the time for debate is past.
The debate is over.
Or so we're told.
97 agree that climate change is real.
Yeah, we've heard that too. The activists tell us we must act now, or else.
Time is growing very, very short. President Obama is the last president with a chance.
So if it feels as though you're being rushed, maybe you are. Prominent scientists from around the world reject claims of a climate catastrophe. In fact, growing numbers of experts see the whole issue as a sleight of hand, a climate hustle. This is the con game known as three-card Monte. The dealer pressures the mark, the person he hopes to fool, into playing his game. It's a simple game of deception designed to lure a person into thinking he can predict which of the three cards is the Queen of Hearts. Only the mark never wins. The flim-flam man knows this and takes his money. When the people pushing to get you into the game, the ones who are predicting a calamitous future due to global warming, don't show their cards, it is a hustle. They tell us we need to get rid of the fuels that power our homes and cars and factories and cities and economies. But global warming fears have led to the government regulating our light bulbs and thermostats and vehicles. And now there are even proposals for carbon ration budgets for every man, woman, and child on the planet.
Open up or we'll bust it! Energy, please. We're here to check out your power consumption.
Oh, look at this, a microwave! Hey, plasma TV.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Yet climate activists claim the debate is over, that no scientists disagree, and that we face a certain calamity unless we act now before it's too late. These are the hallmarks of a hustle. In this film, we're going to show you all the cards. You'll hear from scientists from prestigious institutions worldwide, including NASA, Princeton, the University of London, Georgia Institute of Technology, University of Pennsylvania, and many more. Some have won Nobel Prizes, and many are former or current UN climate panel scientists who have now turned on the UN. You'll see all of the cards. And we'll let you decide for yourself if they are playing it straight. Or if you are being hustled. Global warming has many claims, but one of the most persistent is that 97% of scientists all agree.
Between 95 and 97% of scientists agree that climate change is happening now.
97% of experts say this, 3% say that, and conservatives are saying, I'm going to go with the 3%. That's not conservative. That's Trotskyite radical.
I'm an AP environmental science teacher, so I teach high school environmental science. And yes, we like to tell our students that the majority of science, all of them in fact, do agree. I wanted to have it smart scientists, 10 out of 10 smart scientists agree.
If we'd had this interview, Mark, 10 years ago, I would have said, I've never thought about climate. I assume all the scientists who are reporting and telling the President and the Prime Minister of England are right.
I didn't have any reason not to accept the judgment of my colleagues. You know, the consensus and the whole IPCC process, and, you know, I bought into it. You know, don't trust what one scientist says, trust what these hundreds, thousands of international scientists have come up with years of deliberation.
When somebody asked me 8 or 10 years ago, Leighton, what's causing global warming? I said, well, I guess it's carbon dioxide. That's all I'd ever heard.
Any wisps of doubt that human activities are at fault are now gone with the wind.
So I bought into that and supported the consensus.
You think it's global warming?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Do you, James?
Yeah.
We're unanimous. We all think it's global warming.
Science does not function by consensus, and most certainly not by politically driven consensus. In fact, the history of consensus in science is terrible. From Galileo right the way through the beginning of the 20th century, when 95% of scientists, for goodness sake, believed in eugenics. Science has to, by its very nature, be skeptical.
So basically what you get is you get hundreds of scientists that just repeat what they've heard. You know, in the medical community, it might have been years ago, you know, all medical experts, all doctors agreed that stomach ulcers were caused by, you know, stress and spicy food.
Professor William Schlesinger, who served as a UN climate panel lead author, freely admits that very few UN scientists are climate experts.
There's a huge range of different disciplines represented there. I'm going to have to give you a guess. That's something on the order of 20% that have some dealing with climate.
The fact that there are people sort of who are nominally there does not really mean that they support what is going on. Working Group 2 was essentially run by a small clique of people. Automatically a small group forms that runs the thing. And unfortunately that small group, I would think, are not the most representative or the most balanced or the most unbiased of people.
Out of 100 scientists, 97 agree that climate change is real. At this point, who's refusing to accept the science?
Well, I guess we could agree to disagree.
That's a marketing, that's an advertising ploy. I don't think it means anything. I don't think 97% of people who look at the climate data critically share the opinion that anthropogenic emissions of CO2 is the primary driver of climate.
The 97% estimate is bandied about by basically everybody. I had a close look at what this study really did. As far as I can see, this estimate just crumbles when you touch it. None of the statements in the papers is supported by any data that is actually in the paper, but this 97% is essentially pulled from thin air. It's not based on any credible research whatsoever.
But one survey that claimed 97% of scientists agreed was not based on thousands of scientists or even hundreds of scientists, but only on 77. Of those 77 scientists, 75 answered the survey to form the mythical 97% consensus. In this instance, the 97% wasn't even 97 scientists.
It's fiction. 97% was a figure that was arrived at many years ago by the people who pushed this agenda. They then realized they needed some sort of support for it, so they did a couple of very dopey papers.
Proponents of man-made global warming often point out that the National Academy of Sciences and the American Meteorological Society and other large science groups have issued statements endorsing the so-called consensus view. But
not a single one of those scientific organizations that have issued these very dramatic statements agreeing with the IPCC and the Royal Society actually polled their scientist members and showed that a majority of their members agree. Many scientists who do not agree with the statement attributed to all of them. They never poll their rank and file.
But it's nothing new. If we were here 100 years ago and I was in the psychology department, I'd be telling you that by the science of craniology, black people are stupider than white people, West Europeans are smarter and more creative than East Europeans. This was called phrenology. And all the data and statistics that they could line up and shuffle supported it. And everybody believed it.
To me, these kinds of claims of settled science, it's really antithetical to the scientific process. It reflects confirmation bias, groupthink.
So it's simply propaganda.
The man-made global warming narrative says the evidence is all in, and mankind is responsible for a climate calamity. So let's first take a look at some of the scientific claims backing up the alleged climate crisis.
Increased amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere mean more heat is trapped, warming the Earth.
Most scientists agree that rising temperatures are caused by an increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide, fueled by mankind's consumption of fossil fuels.
Is carbon dioxide, an essential trace gas in the atmosphere, the key driver of global temperatures?
The CO2 we are putting into the atmosphere right now is going to add to warming for decades into the future.
So you can get to a situation where the oceans will begin to boil.
Boiling the oceans? Well, before we get there, let's first examine the source of all this fear: rising CO2 levels.
Climate is the most complex, coupled, non-linear, chaotic system known to man. Of course there are human influences in it, nobody denies that. But what outcome will they get by fiddling with one variable at the margins? I'm sorry, it's scientific nonsense.
The climate system is extremely complex.
It's virtually impossible to think of doing an experiment where we'd be able to tweeze out the impact of CO2 versus the hundreds of other variables at work.
Because we've only been shining our flashlight on one thing, that's the human carbon dioxide and aerosols, we've been neglecting a whole lot of other things, like the sun's influence on climate.
Is carbon dioxide the control knob?
I don't see anything in the long-term geologic record to support that conclusion. CO2 is one of many, many, many variables that influence the Earth's temperature.
Dr. Robert Giegenkek chaired the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Are you afraid of rising CO2 concentration?
No, I'm not. CO2 is not the villain that has been portrayed.
CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It does trap some heat, but its ability to trap more heat declines logarithmically.
This cube represents man-made CO2, a greenhouse gas. Although it can build up in the atmosphere, it's only 3.5% of all the CO2 emitted each year. The rest is natural. Water vapor makes up 95% of all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases make up only 2% of the total atmosphere. So is that one cube of man-made CO2 driving the climate?
Putting a price tag on each ton of CO2 poison,
CO2 is not a pollutant. It's not a poison, and we should not corrupt the English language by depriving pollutant and poison of their original meaning. We're really in a CO2 famine now. Most of the time it's at least 1,000, and it's been quite a bit higher than that. The Earth was just fine in those times.
The fact that there was both higher temperatures and an ice age at a time when CO2 was 10 times higher than today fundamentally contradicts the certainty CO2 emissions are the main cause of climate change. Water is the most important greenhouse gas by far.
I'm impressed by the fact that the present climate, from the perspective of a geologist, is very close to the coldest it's ever been. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere today is close to the lowest it's ever been.
We are currently living on a carbon dioxide-starved planet, and were we to double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the figure everybody fears, that would be a small step back towards restoring the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
You can't use carbon dioxide to control the climate. The plants are growing more robustly, food crops, the trees, the forests. Earth has been getting greener and greener and greener. We're just fertilizing the plants.
So the idea that doubling carbon dioxide is going to be environmentally catastrophic, it's not even wrong. It's just a silly idea. We're not dealing with a scientific issue. We haven't been dealing with a scientific issue now for 15 years. We're dealing with a determined political issue. It's a campaign cause.
Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together?
Well, in fact, in an inconvenient truth, Al Gore used the graph of the Vostok ice cores. He said this proves that CO2 and temperature are directly causally related. But he didn't show that actually the temperature goes up first, usually by about 800 years before the CO2 goes up.
More CO2 equals a warmer world. True or false?
I don't know. I mean, it may be the other way around. Certainly a warmer world will lead to more CO2. But I'm not impressed that CO2 is the driver of global temperature. And there are so many other variables that are much more likely to have been responsible for that.
Here is where CO2 is now. Way above where it's ever been as far back as this record will measure.
Gore's chart may seem impressive, but the geologic record shows that CO2 levels in the distant past were far greater than they are today.
It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is, and we've done that. Here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years. Ultimately, this is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue. If we allow that to happen, it is deeply unethical.
Al Gore genuinely believes that if he does not prevail, the apocalypse is coming. His opponents think he is the danger.
I think it's a wonderful teaching tool because it shows how we don't do science.
I voted for Gore in 2000, yeah, and I think that if he ran again, depending on who he ran against, I might vote for him. He's a smart man.
But after viewing Gore's film, Giegengak had this reaction.
And I was appalled. I was appalled because he either deliberately misrepresented the point it was making or didn't understand it. So it was irresponsible of Al Gore.
The verdict from the Nobel Committee must be sweet vindication.
Even the Nobel Prize is not going to be enough to silence the naysayers, some of whom still believe that man is not responsible for global warming.
One of those naysayers is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist himself, physicist Dr. Ivar Giaever, who won the Nobel in 1973.
These two people got the Nobel Prize in peace, and I am ashamed of the Norwegian government who did that.
What did Al Gore leave out? As we've detailed, there are literally hundreds of factors that influence global temperature. The real question is CO2 the tail that wags the dog? Come here. Come here. This is the question. Does this part of the dog control the rest of the dog? That's the atmospheric equivalent of what Al Gore wants you to believe. Good dog. Al Gore wants you to believe that CO2 level up there is the greatest moral and ethical dilemma of our day. Let's play Al Gore's game. We're going to show you what Al Gore left out of his famous scene in An Inconvenient Truth. So, I think they showed me how to use this thing. Let's see if I got it here. All right. Let it ride. All right, steady. Thank you. Here we are. This is the CO2 level Al Gore wants you to be alarmed at. 400 parts per million. This, according to scientists, means the Earth is currently in a CO2 famine, geologically speaking. Al Gore didn't mention that. Take you up to that CO2 level. Okay, Al Gore did not mention the fact that there are quite literally hundreds of other factors, according to scientists, that influence our global climate. He downplayed all these hundreds of other factors. Let's just give you but a small sampling of a few. Let's start with the sun. Oh, okay, that's pretty bright. The sun is one of the key drivers that Al Gore tries to diminish. Volcanoes. Whoa, that's a big one. Is that Mount Pinatubo? Volcanoes and the lack of atmospheric dust have had a big impact on our climate. There's also cosmic rays. There's also solar system impact. There's also tilt of the Earth's axis. Whoa, okay. Okay, steady it out. We're listing. Okay, all right, we got it. There's also atmospheric circulation. Whoa. Okay. Wind tunnel testing. There's also water vapor. There's also methane. And yes, that does include the infamous cows belching and... Oh, really? Yeah, flatulence. Okay. Oh, no. Get it back. Get back. No. We don't need that. All right. You got clouds, reflectivity of the earth, albedo. You have forests, land use policies, soils, and ocean cycles. Okay. We have a situation here where all these factors come together. This and many other factors that Al Gore left out. And all of these, whoa, the wind is blowing. It's not simply CO2 or the sun, CO2 or the oceans, it's CO2 versus hundreds of other factors influencing our global climate system into a perfect atmospheric storm, raging all the time. So by overemphasizing the role of CO2 and underestimating the role of many other factors, the whole argument of whether or not the world is heading toward an environmental disaster gets pretty skewed. But how has the alleged climate consensus changed over time? After all, concern about the weather has been around for a long time. Well before fossil fuels caused global warming, everyone was worried about, well, a coming ice age.
Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way.
If we are unprepared for the next advance, the result could be hunger and death on a scale unprecedented in all of history. What scientists are telling us now is that the threat of an ice age is not as remote as they once thought. During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
British professor Hubert Lamb says that a new ice age is creeping over the northern hemisphere.
In his comment tonight, Howard K. Smith talks about the weather and suggests that we better do something about it. Howard?
We are over ready for a return of the ice. Experts like Reeve Bryson, the head of the biggest meteorological department in the world in Wisconsin, believe that since 1945, that has been in progress. We're returning to an ice age. The argument that we face some long, cold years is pretty convincing.
The 1970s global cooling scare was widespread. Before fossil fuels caused global warming, fossil fuels caused global cooling.
We've never been warned like this before, all of us, about climate change.
I remember when I was a small boy, say 60 years ago, snows were frequent and deep every winter. A change in our climate is taking place. Snows are less frequent and less deep.
Thomas Jefferson said that.
A considerable change of climate must have taken place in the polar regions. The Greenland seas have been covered in ice, which in the last 2 years entirely disappeared.
This was reported by the president of the UK Royal Society. No, not the current president, but Sir Joseph Banks, president in 1817. Here's a more recent quote.
There are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth.
This was from Newsweek magazine in 1975, but it wasn't about global warming, it was a warning of global cooling. 1988 was the year the UN formed its climate panel, the IPCC. 1988 was also the year that NASA's James Hansen testified to Congress about the urgency of global warming. It was orchestrated in part by then Senators Al Gore and Timothy Worth. It was a key moment when global cooling was officially put to bed and the conversion to global warming occurred. Years later, a PBS Frontline episode lifted the curtain on the sort of illusions that politicians employed to kick off their climate campaigns.
On Capitol Hill, Senator Timothy Worth was one of the few politicians already concerned about global warming. And he was not above using a little stagecraft for Hansen's testimony.
We called the Weather Bureau and found out what historically was the hottest day of the summer. So we scheduled the hearing that day.
Did you also alter the temperature in the hearing room that day?
What we did was that went in the night before and opened all the windows, I will admit, right, so that the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room.
Dr. Hansen, if you'd start us off, we'd appreciate it.
The wonderful Jim Hansen, who was wiping his brow at the table at the hearing.
Number one, the Earth is warmer in 1988 than at any time in the history of instrumental measurements.
One of Hansen's former supervisors explained that Hansen's dramatic testimony was not well received at NASA.
We were somewhat appalled. We were certainly embarrassed. We did not muzzle our scientists at all. I probably would have been removed had I tried to cut off Jim Hansen's funding. After all, he had Al Gore on his team.
Well, that was pretty revealing. But even that kind of stagecraft isn't enough to completely fool the public. You have to keep the people in the dark. And by the way, three-card Monty is just another version of the old shell game. So let's see what's next in the cards.
It's clear that the Arctic sea ice is beginning to recede very rapidly.
We saw Arctic sea ice diminish to the lowest level we've ever seen.
Already, polar bears are starving as the ice they hunt on vanishes, along with the seals they eat.
Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet are melting faster than anyone expected.
The polar bear bears a disproportionate burden of the climate, the combustion profligacy, energy profligacy. So the polar bear is having a voice here as part of the march.
Satellite monitoring of the Arctic ice began in 1979 at the end of a 40-year cooling cycle when fears of a coming ice age were at their height.
You have to look at it in the longer perspective. And in that longer perspective, we know that there was as little or less ice in the Arctic Ocean back in the 1930s to early 40s as there is today.
The North Pole lost 1/3 of its area and 40% of its thickness.
And it didn't cause a huge amount of problem there, either with polar bears or anything else.
Are polar bears disappearing? In 1960, as few as 5,000 polar bears roamed the Earth. Fast forward 5 decades, their population has only grown.
There are probably 5 times as many polar bears now as there were in the 1970s, so it doesn't look like they're hurting too much.
They're looking for poster children. It suits their advertising purpose. It has nothing to do with science. The fact that over the last 20 years of the 20th century there was a minor fall in the area of sea level ice tells you nothing about climate change.
If you compare the temperatures that were present in Greenland in the 1930s, for example, and 1920s, it's clear that it was warmer in Greenland in the 1930s than it is right now. And so this is nothing unusual.
Perhaps the most inexplicable claim about Arctic sea ice came from White House science advisor John Holdren.
If you lose the summer sea ice, there are phenomena that could lead you not so very long thereafter to lose the winter sea ice as well. And if you lose that sea ice year-round, it's going to mean drastic climatic change all over the hemisphere.
Oh my, okay, unless the continents really
diverge away, so that the Arctic is no longer enclosed, you will have winter sea ice. Okay, so that's not going to happen.
Mr. Holden, you said there'd be an ice-free Arctic in the winter. Do you still stand by that prediction? And do you want to retract that? Any comment on that?
I'm late for a meeting.
He's late for a meeting, is his comment.
We're seeing records set for Antarctic sea ice extent. And this is, climate models predict that Antarctic should be losing sea ice, and it's exactly the opposite of what's happening.
I have to laugh, pardon me for laughing, because the Antarctic ice cap is not melting. The average annual temperature there is 58 degrees below zero. There's not melting going on in the first place. It's actually growing.
Why is the sea ice at record high?
I think it's getting colder. Very simple.
Some scientists say sea level has accelerated. Other scientists say sea level has decelerated. Climate fear promoters tell us that getting this right could be the difference between business as usual or being all wet.
If enough of that ice melts, the seas will rise dramatically, and the results will be calamitous.
The scientists now think a sea level rise of 10 feet or more is inevitable and that there's nothing we can do now to stop it.
A surreal set of images of what 5, 12, and 25 feet of sea level rise would look like at the Jefferson Memorial.
The Supreme Court would be flooded. You could tie your boat to the Washington Monument, and storm surges would make the Capitol unusable.
There's no question that sea level rise on the whole over the last few decades has accelerated compared to what it was in the past.
That statement is wrong. Sea level is not accelerating. It is, if anything, diminishing.
Al Gore shows half of Florida underwater.
No, there's models. I mean, they're doing it wrongly, and this is lobbying. So we start. Geological facts are on one side, lobbying and models are on the other side.
If you look at the total global sea level from about 1850 until the present time, it's been rising at a fairly constant rate, rather slow, about 7 inches a century. If you're 50 years old, you've experienced a sea level rise of about 3.5 inches, and you probably didn't notice it.
The rate of sea level rise has decelerated over the last few decades, from year to year.
Not 2 decades, but in the last decade.
I really don't want to argue scientific details with you because I know them better than you do, Mark, as well and as much as you do follow these things.
Tonight on World News, force of nature, a strange storm in New York, a parade of hurricanes tearing across the ocean. Is this evidence of the new age of global warming?
Wildfires and heat waves are more intense.
What used to be the extreme, literally becoming the new normal.
Hurricane Katrina was the first urban extinction.
And scientists are worried that the sustained droughts are consistent with the overall trend toward global warming.
Far heavier downpours. They'll be more frequent now, say scientists, as global warming heats the air.
Oh. It's easy to get lulled into believing these wild claims because we hear them over and over again. But if you don't want to be hustled, you have to check the deck. You have to make sure that all the cards are exposed, not just the ones the con man want you to see. So let's see what other scientists and data have to say about all these alarming claims.
It is misleading and just plain incorrect to claim that disasters associated with hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, or drought have increased on climate timescales either in the United States or globally.
All of the indicators of extreme weather are absent.
It's not a theoretical issue what the weather would be like below 350 parts per million CO2 because until the year 1988, the CO2 was below 350 parts per million. So if you look through the historical record, you see that the weather was just as bad or possibly worse below 350 ppm.
It is further incorrect to associate the increasing costs of disasters with the emission of greenhouse gases. Some activists, politicians, journalists, corporate and government agency representatives, and even scientists who should know better have made claims that are just unsupportable based on evidence and research.
The more powerful hurricanes are mainly due
to man-made global warming.
Typhoons and hurricanes are getting stronger.
Hurricanes have not increased in the U.S. in frequency, intensity, or normalized damage since at least 1900. The same holds for tropical cyclones globally since at least 1970, when we have good data.
We are in the weakest hurricane period since records started being kept in 1900.
Of course, our hurricane luck could run out at any time, but the data shows that anyone claiming an increase in hurricane activity due to global warming is off base.
The forecast from hell. Why America may see more killer tornadoes.
Tornadoes have not increased in frequency, intensity, or normalized damage since at least 1950. And there's some evidence to suggest they've actually declined.
And if you look at NOAA plots of severe tornadoes, they've actually generally been declining since the 1970s.
And it's making the droughts much more likely and more intense.
Globally, and I quote from a recent paper in Nature, there has been little change in drought over the past 60 years. Drought has, and here I quote the IPCC, for the most part become shorter, less frequent, and cover a smaller portion of the U.S. over the last century.
A record winter of rain and flood. More evidence of global warming.
Floods have not increased in the U.S. in frequency or intensity since at least 1950. And remarkably, flood losses as a percentage of U.S. GDP have dropped by 75% since 1940.
Unfortunately, the climate models, and this is very important for you to understand, you can take a look at the ensemble of the United Nations climate models. They are failing at the 95% level. They're predicting too much warming.
I'm not impressed by the ability of the models to either to model the past or to model the future.
They say when they do the models, the current warming can only be explained by CO2.
Well, it's simply untrue. It can be explained by a whole host of other factors. They just choose not to consider those factors.
The models tend to overreact to carbon dioxide by warming the Earth much more than what has actually happened.
I think the models are basically flawed.
Temperature records have been altered considerably. Particularly in the U.S. Historical Climate Network. The alterations in general result in a cooler past and a warmer present.
The temperature record has essentially doubled in trend over the last 30 years due to adjustments and siting issues.
The Earth is hotter now than ever, and humans are to blame.
The hottest year ever in recorded history.
I'm running in the park on Saturday in shorts thinking, this is great, but are we all going to die? You know, I can't figure this out.
We've all heard the hype about the hottest years on record, but satellite data tells us that global temperatures have held steady for almost 2 decades through early 2016. Even the ground-based measurements backing up these so-called hottest year claims reveal differences of only a few hundredths to barely tenths of a degree, almost immeasurable. Even if the pause ended today, the nearly 20-year standstill in temperatures defied predictions of a planet in crisis.
0.8 degrees is what we're discussing in global warming. 0.8 degrees. If you ask people in general what it is, they think it's 4 or 5 degrees. They don't know it's so little. It's not even fever.
I call this sort of stuff kindergarten science. The fact that the temperature was warmer at the end of the 20th century than it was in the preceding 100 years is such a piece of kindergarten science. It's true, and it's completely meaningless in telling you anything about climate change.
The Earth has a fever that is growing more and more intense.
I do not believe the Earth has a fever because it's colder now than it has been through most of the history of life.
As you can see on the so-called hockey stick graph, it looks like a hockey stick lying on its side there. You can see the temperatures all the way back to the year 1000.
I didn't like it when I first saw it. And when I saw that curve, 2 things occurred to me. One, I missed the medieval warm phase, which is very, very well documented. And most people who've looked at the medieval warm phase think that the temperature was higher then than it is now. And the second thing I saw, there's a kink in his curve, and the kink exactly coincided with the change in the way the measurements were made. And that should raise the suspicion of any scientist.
There hasn't really been any statistically significant warming since 1998. Okay. This is in spite of 25% of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide has been put in the atmosphere since 1998.
You've had a long period with no warming, and now accounting for more than half the satellite record.
So this is the big mystery, and it's exactly, until we have a good answer for that, I say we don't have any particular confidence in attributing the warming of the last quarter of the 20th century.
I don't feel the need to explain the halt in warming because there's so many unknowns and there's so many variables in the climate system, I could attribute it to almost anything. The only people who feel a need to explain that is the ones who have gone out on a limb and insisted that CO2 is a controlling factor.
So this pause is now, statistically speaking, significant. It's now something they can't just brush aside. They can't just say it's happened before. They can't just say it's what they expected. They didn't.
Sounds like claims that the debate is over and the science is settled don't hold up very well under scrutiny. Extreme weather events are not increasing. Global temperatures are not alarming. Polar bears and ice caps are doing okay. But all good conmen know that the confidence game falls apart if you have time to slow down. Take your time. Check the details carefully. That's why they must insist time is short, that action must be taken immediately to avoid a bigger problem. We saw this with the Y2K scare.
We also must be ready for the 21st century from its very first moment by solving the so-called Y2K computer problem. Now,
the Mayan calendar deadline of 2012 scared many.
All because folks believe the end of the world is going to come beginning in December, 3 years from now.
And now, global warming advocates have been pushing a series of so-called tipping points, saying we will tip the scales and go past the point of no return if we don't act immediately.
We are running out of time. We have to get to an ambitious global agreement.
We have to do it this year. Not next year, this year.
This is a huge crisis.
But then it can cross a tipping point and suddenly shift into high gear.
I fear there is not a moment to lose.
And of course the clock is ticking because Mother Nature does not do bailouts.
Scientists believe we have less than 10 years to bring these emissions under control to prevent a catastrophe.
There is an urgency to acting unlike anything we've seen before.
This could be their last best chance to deal with the consequences of climate change.
We could pass tipping points with grave consequences.
Way back in 1989, the UN also issued a tipping point, a 10-year climate tipping point, or entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth.
Be in no doubt that unless greenhouse gas emissions reach their peak within about 100 months, just 100 months, it may well be too late to stop temperatures rising beyond dangerous levels. The grim reality is that our planet has reached a point of crisis, and we have only 7 years before we lose the levers of control. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have only 86 months left before we reach the tipping point. We are running out of time. How many times have I found myself saying this over recent years?
It's hard to keep up with all these predictions. Is it decades?
We need to cut the consumption of fossil fuels by over half in the next 20 years.
Years.
The clock is ticking.
Days. Hours. Now?
We have to do something right now to stop global warming.
Why do tipping points persist in the climate debate?
The experts often don't know any more than you and I about what's going to happen in the future. So the idea that climate scientists have this crystal ball and they know what's coming, I find that very hard to believe. There was global cooling, and prior to that there was the population bomb. You know, millions of people were going to starve to death because we couldn't possibly feed this many humans. There's always something.
It installs fear. If you think that your house is going to be underwater in the next 10 years, you're going to be frightened and you're going to be willing to accept things that are being proposed by other people.
And we should also understand that psychologically there's obviously something in us as human beings where we have been primed to always be worried about our survival and our existence. So we are very predisposed to a narrative that says, you know, we're all going to die, we're all going to die.
Creating artificial deadlines and telling people to hurry, hurry, hurry is an easy way to pressure them into making poor decisions. But there's another way to convince people and trick them into handing over their money. It involves the use of magic.
Can man pass legislation through the EPA, the United Nations, Congress, and change and alter the weather, the global temperature, the path and frequency, intensity of storms?
The scientists at NASA say we can slow the Earth's warming if we cut pollution and have higher carbon emission standards.
It's our choice how fast the seas rise, and that gives us time to prepare and protect our communities in a smart way.
Around the world, the anger runs as deep as the floodwaters being blamed on the global warming the Kyoto Treaty was supposed to fight.
Carbon could cost us the planet.
What impact would the EPA regulations have on the climate, though?
Very, very positive. This was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. Climate change is not a hoax. More droughts and floods and wildfires are not a joke. They are a threat to our children's future. And in this election, you can do something about it. You can do something about it. You can do something about it.
When President Obama says this will be the time that the waters started to recede because I'm elected, it reminds me of King Canute, who took all his advisors down to the shores of England and said, "See how powerful I am? Tell the waters to go out."
What is the real tipping point number? When do we have to act by it?
The real tipping point for me is that governments stay below 2 degrees Celsius of global warming.
Not doing it will be catastrophic. And basically, none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Civilization will have broken down. What the few people who are left will be living in a failed state like Somalia or Sudan.
So try to attribute a given weather event due to added CO2 or whatever is impossible. And I think we're misleading the public by telling them that we know why climate is behaving the way it is.
I would love to be able to think we can control climate, when of course it is indeed going to have to be adaptation, flexibility, but to an outcome that we don't know, because I actually don't know what climate they're wanting to produce for us. And actually I don't think they know either.
Today, a form of climate astrology has taken hold, where every bad weather event is somehow used to prove man-made climate change. Has our modern society advanced? Today, global warming is blamed for causing or worsening a whole range of issues, including prostitution, airplane turbulence, crime, rape, car thefts, and barroom brawls.
That's right, your morning cup of Joe could become a thing of the past.
But a new study is dark with no sugar. It says climate change has the wild Arabica coffee plant headed for extinction.
In fact, anybody who eats is under threat from climate change.
Several liberal lawmakers are pushing a resolution to warn women that climate change could make them vulnerable to, quote, sex work transactional sex.
As a woman, does it worry you that unchecked global warming will lead to prostitution?
That's pretty ludicrous, yeah.
U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan has claimed global warming creates volatility, and I feel it when I'm flying.
I don't know who's paying for these studies or who, where do these people get their salaries? I mean, this stuff is so ludicrous, but there's this whole cottage industry.
Will a carbon tax prevent airline turbulence?
Changes in disease trajectories, all kinds of implications that we can't even fully fathom.
Global warming is even affecting the dead. Here's a list of hundreds of things caused by global warming. Sacrifice to prevent climate change is now being proposed.
When you see that charge in the wall, you have to now say, okay, that's contributing to global warming pollution. I have to pull that charger out of the wall.
In 2010, the Japanese government told its citizens to go to bed 1 hour earlier in order to fight climate change.
Are we under siege from nature? Is the planet angry?
We've been taking Earth for granted. Now I guess it's paying us back.
Witches were once blamed for bad weather and crop failures.
The severe conditions in climate brought about crop failure, starvation, disease, death, and social unrest.
Dr. Sally Baliunas of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics explained how the severe conditions of the Little Ice Age in the Middle Ages created a perfect atmosphere for witchcraft trials.
They said for 100 years, such a storm had not been seen. The storm was deemed so unusual in this period of superstition that it had to be unnatural. It had to be supernatural.
Every night on the news now practically is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
Legal philosopher Jean Baudin in 1580 noted that witchcraft was the most terrible problem facing humankind. Again, a very modern note.
No challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change.
Now, there were skeptics who stood up, but they were often accused of, or threatened to be accused of sorcery to squash any debate.
When I tell environmental activists that global warming itself is not something to be concerned about, environmental activists attack me.
Any feeble notes of humane skepticism had to be wrenched out of society.
They shun me and they do not allow me to have my materials published in their various magazines and so on.
Any country which tolerates these skeptics will be struck by plagues, famines, and wars.
And many other superstitions were common in other cultures. In 1450, Aztec priests encouraged people to sacrifice blood to the gods to end severe drought that decimated corn crops. They ended up sacrificing thousands of people in a few weeks. In 1846 in Australia, Aborigines blamed the bad climate on the introduction of the white man in Australia. In 1933, Syria banned the yo-yo because they thought it caused drought. During the 1940s, some blamed World War II for causing weather extremes. Global warming, climate change, global climate disruption, global weirding. It's been called many names.
Global weirding, that's really what we're going to face. What actually happens in climate change is that the weather gets weird. The hots get hotter, the dries get drier and longer and wider. The rains get heavier, the snows get thicker. The weather gets weird.
The continued identification of every severe weather event or forest fire or whatever with global warming hasn't stopped, even though the IPCC itself found very little linkage between human-caused global warming and these extreme weather events. That doesn't seem to stop the advocates who are continuing to use science in a misleading way.
In 2000, global warming activist Michael Oppenheimer told the New York Times that he bought a sled for his daughter, but it's been sitting in the stairwell and hasn't been used. Snow is a thing of the past. Children won't know what sledding is.
What did the activists say when the snow started piling up?
This is global warming, even though it's freezing.
Right, well, and that's why I don't like the phrase global warming. I like climate change.
Yeah, it's going to get hot, but you're also going to have snow in the summer in some places.
Every day we are getting new evidence of the effects of man-made climate change. Today, the Northeast Plains and lower Midwest are digging out from another round of snow and freezing rain.
It's consistent with what you'd expect.
The message went from global warming causes less snow to global warming causes more snow.
So Boston, as of this point, is in its number 2 snowiest winter.
Is this all part of climate change?
I think it is.
More snow, less snow, forest fires increase, forest fires decrease, malaria increase, malaria decrease, more fog, less fog, winters warmer, winters colder. So no matter the outcome, they can claim they predicted it.
I tried to ask Oppenheimer about his sled comment in 2000, given that this is the snowiest decade ever recorded for the U.S. East Coast, according to meteorologist Joe DeLeo. But my interview with Oppenheimer was unexpectedly cut short.
2000 New York Times, you mentioned you bought your daughter a sled, but she hadn't been able to use it. And then, of course, now we're in the...
Dr. Oppenheimer has to testify.
Yes, he does. Okay.
All
right, well, thank you.
Perhaps next time we can ask Oppenheimer about his daughter's sled.
And just where is global warming hitting the hardest?
Scientists called it ground zero for climate change.
Behind us is really ground zero.
We're at ground zero for climate change.
Florida is ground zero.
I've noticed in my driving now that I'm seeing armadillos, places where I've never seen them before, much farther north than I've ever seen them in the past.
Now let's go back, and the same ABC News is touting the little armadillo as proof, yes, you guessed it, of global cooling.
Signs of cooling have already begun. They began about 1945. Homely things like the flight of the heat-loving armadillo from Nebraska to Mexico.
The armadillo holds a distinction of being used as evidence of global cooling in the 1970s, and now is being used as evidence of global warming. Throughout history, the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars were often considered magical. Almost anything could be blamed on the skies above. Today, it seems like almost anything can be blamed on climate change. Bad coffee crops, armadillos migrating north or south, tornadoes, mummies decaying too fast. These are the new measures of global warming.
As the science behind climate fears weaken, activists are now realizing that if you can't silence the message, silence the messenger.
Now Hansen has gone even further, calling for the CEOs of fossil fuel companies to be tried for crimes against humanity.
They should be blamed because they have supported misinformation to the public.
Do I think they should be in jail? I think they should be enjoying 3 hots and a cot at The Hague with all the other war criminals. I think it's treason. I wish that there were a law you could punish them under.
Every time you address the Holocaust, you don't bring somebody in that says it didn't happen.
There were people saying, don't worry, Hitler is not real. It'll disappear.
I do think it's often a mistake to call them climate skeptics. I think they're deniers. Just as I think President Ahmadinejad of Iran, who claims not to believe that the Holocaust occurred, he knows it did.
And we're at that stage now. We have Holocaust deniers, we have climate change deniers, and to be honest, I don't think there's a great deal of difference.
They're almost like the ones who still believe that the moon landing was staged in a movie lot in Arizona.
But these tactics are creating quite a backlash. What motivated you to finally speak up?
Anger. I was pretty angry. The quotes were asinine.
Has man been on the moon? Well, I helped get man on the moon, so I know that man has been on the moon. I mean, I happen to know that the Earth is round.
And I was being insulted by people who knew far less about these things than I did. And I found that preposterous. And that's why I decided to start speaking out. It did not help me in the least. It's only hurt me professionally and for my career. But you can't sit back and take that kind of thing.
Either they ignore you or they ridicule you, and that's not the scientific method.
And so this hate speech, which is the one thing the climate left knows how to do, is backfiring badly on them now.
Far from being scared off, more and more prominent scientists are re-examining the evidence about man-made global warming and are reversing their views, many of them politically left. Former French Party Socialist member and award-winning geophysicist Dr. Claude Allegre was one of the first scientists to warn about the dangers of global warming in a 1992 letter titled World Scientists Warning to Humanity. But Allegre took another look at the evidence, and he has now reversed himself.
But you're known here in France for saying that climate change is not man-made. Do you stand by that claim?
Yeah, absolutely. The CO2 is in a very short proportion in the atmosphere. But my point is, nothing has proved this is man-made climate change.
Green Guru and scientist James Lovelock was one of the leading voices of man-made climate alarm.
Global warming is much more than just a real effect. It's something deadly that'll threaten nearly all of us. Anyone with an imagination can see the awful human consequences of that. And we're talking about something which is only about 30 years ahead.
Like, are you saying that, you're not saying the entire human race will be wiped out, but you're saying
Heavens, no.
But a significant number. You're not talking about a party here.
I'm afraid so. As many as 7 out of 8 are likely to be wiped out, yes.
But Lovelock has now turned his back on man-made global warming fears and has grown steadily more skeptical.
It hasn't actually happened as predicted, has it?
No, it hasn't. And it's very interesting because most of us in what you might call the earth science game, climate science as well, and I was one of them, I think made quite a big mistake. We all thought we knew how carbon dioxide in the air and climate were related.
I would say since 2004 I've been very lonely, Mark. I've been lonely working on the Hill for the Democratic Party.
Climate statistics professor Dr. Caleb Rossiter of American University is an outspoken anti-war activist who has a flawless progressive record.
Climate justice in limiting carbon dioxide emissions is a crime against Africa, and it's what motivated me to get involved again in this debate. But teaching statistics, they have to get a peer-reviewed article. One of them happened to pick an IPCC-approved peer-reviewed article that said we can attribute most of the warming in the last 50 years to carbon dioxide. And she writes in her paper, that settles it. I said, no, that opens it. And she said, come on, Dr. Rossiter, let's sit down and look at the article together. And in fact, the article had absolutely no proof. It just said that this is our model and this is what we do. So I raised her grade a little bit to say, well, you did report what they've said, but I can't give you a very good grade because you haven't dug into it and realized there's no basis here for making the statement.
I have been concerned about global warming since 1968, and in the 1980s it looked like the weight of evidence lent towards human-induced to a significant extent, and since then it's moved against it. The evidence has switched from the mid-1980s to now. It's a much weaker case that there's human-induced significant global warming.
Even if all the climate models were true, climate change is not an existential threat. We've been through much, much worse than climate control of this.
Dr. Richard Toll is a lead author for the UN Climate Panel and a professor at the UK's University of Sussex. Toll had his name removed from the IPCC Summary for Policymakers report in 2014 due to what he considered distortions of science.
There's a lot of people who did not volunteer knowing full well what the IPCC is like. So it's not an open process at all.
My position on this has evolved over time.
Climatologist Dr. Judith Curry is the former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
If you want to put a date on, a big sea change in my position regarding the IPCC, well, it was the period late 2009. Again, it was triggered by the ClimateGate emails.
a scandal called ClimateGate. A scandal involving some stolen emails. The language in the emails suggests these scientists manipulated their findings.
I was extremely concerned by those. I thought it did not reflect the kind of behavior, all sorts of things that I was concerned about. Trying to keep data away from people who are trying to get the data. I mean, to me, that was, something that they should absolutely have been making the data available when somebody comes along and wants the data. By the time you get to late spring of 2010, I had been ostracized by the mainstream, the consensus, and had really been pushed over to the other side, if you will, by attacks.
For Greenpeace, which I was involved in the beginning of, it was the threat of all-out nuclear war. We cared about humans because our focus was to stop nuclear war and the destruction of human civilization. That's the peace in Greenpeace. The green part, of course, is nature, and over the years, gradually, Greenpeace lost the peace part and drifted into a position of depicting humans as the enemies of the earth. And in 1986, I left to become an independent environmentalist, basing my positions on science and logic rather than sensationalism, misinformation, and fear.
There is no scientific proof that human emissions of carbon dioxide are the dominant cause of the minor warming of the Earth's atmosphere over the past 100 years.
It's actually not very much about the science. It's always been about economic and political choice. I come from the left wing politically. Climate science and these costs are subprime science, subprime economics, and above all, subprime politics.
But it is as much psychological and social a phenomenon as anything else.
Another politically left scientist to bail out of the global warming movement is physicist Dr. Dennis Rancourt. Rancourt is a former professor and environmental science researcher at the University of Ottawa.
If you want to be an environmentalist, if you're really concerned about saving the boreal forest and habitat destruction and so on, then fight against habitat destruction. Don't go off into this tenuous thing about CO2 concentration in the atmosphere.
There was a epiphany for me in the early 90s. I became skeptical then, but I didn't do anything.
I started to write a book on the humongous impact that Earth's old CO2 levels used to have. After about 4 months, I said, Leighton, you are the dumbest researcher on Earth. You're not finding any evidence of the humongous impact that CO2 had on Earth's old climate because the correlations weren't that good. I think it's the damn catastrophe that people are being misled on this issue.
Let's give this global warming nonsense its Waterloo tonight.
I recently was contacted by somebody out of the blue who said, I've seen the attacks on you. They say you claim to be a member of the House of Lords when you're not. And they said, we can see from the hysterical tone of what is being said that these people are not right, and that was our first clue that you were right.
Dr. Ivar Giaver is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who was one of President Obama's key scientific supporters in 2008. But a few years later, Giaver publicly announced his dissent on man-made global warming.
I don't see that the CO2 is the cause of all this problem. I resigned from the American Physical Society because the statement, energy is incontrovertible. That's a religion. That's a religious statement.
Climate has become a new religion, and that people who disagree would be treated as heretics.
The title was Climate Heretic Judith Curry Turns on Her Colleagues. And so I responded with a rather blistering blog post, and the punchline of that is that if IPCC is dogma, then count me in as a heretic. And I was sort of booted out of the tribe, if you will.
When my think tank announced that they were going to start a climate divestment campaign, I wrote a very long memo back to the director, explaining why I thought this was a terrible idea. We need to stop and look at the data. I want to have a debate with the staff and the board. And he said, no, we know your views, Caleb. So it was because I could not reach the board and them directly that I wrote the piece for the Wall Street Journal. 2 days later, I was handed my walking papers from a 23-year association with that think tank. They felt it was best that I be terminated because my views on African development and climate change and climate justice were divergent from theirs. So I'm willing to express my opinions and have them come out. This is the first time I've expressed an opinion that was alien to the left.
It is a convergence of interests of powerful elites, including the media, who want sensation, the environmental movement, who want donations, the politicians who want to appear to be saving the world, the businesses who want to look green, the academics and universities that want public money for grants to study this.
So let's review some of what we've seen, because there's certainly no shortage of claims that man-made global warming will result in an ecological disaster with the world's very survival at stake. The evidence for this claim is severely lacking. By virtually every measure, from global temperatures and climate model predictions to polar bears, sea level rise, and extreme weather events, the claims of climate fear promoters are either falling short or going in the opposite direction. Then there's the claim that rising levels of carbon dioxide are a major threat facing humanity. Scientists point to geological data that shows CO2 and temperature are not in lockstep, and CO2 is drowned out by many, many other variables. We've even looked back and forth at the history of climate change claims. We've seen scientific consensus move from a coming ice age to a boiling planet, and we've discovered that throughout history, concerns about the weather have been used to generate fear and manipulate the public. We've examined the claims that an overwhelming scientific consensus exists for man-made global warming, the oft-repeated notion that 97% of scientists agree. We've shown that this alleged consensus is merely an illusion, carefully crafted by what amounts to an ideological effort to promote global warming fears in their so-called solutions. And we've shown that an increasing number of prestigious scientists are re-examining the evidence and are challenging the climate claims being put forth by the United Nations, Al Gore, and climate activists, and being hyped by the mainstream media. We've seen a lot, but we've not seen all the cards just yet, because there's still one more deck. One more deck to explain much of what's behind the global warming movement. In our next film, we will complete the picture of the climate change grand narrative and the agenda behind it.
Outrage growing over the co-chair of a UN climate change panel saying this: one must say clearly that we redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy.
One of the ways it will drive the change is through global governance and global agreements.
We will look at the financing of the climate establishment and the big green movement behind it.
It is absolutely true that the money available for global warming statements and research is driving academia right now, and people line up to get it.
The Sierra Club took $26 million from natural gas, and Michael has the audacity to try to imply that skeptics are fossil fuel funded. You also had a financial interest, given that $250,000 came from Hollywood, Barbara Streisand, to fund you. We will expose the hypocrisy of many of the politicians, Hollywood celebrities, and other top climate campaigners.
For instance, did you know that just air drying your clothes for 6 months per person saves 700 pounds of carbon dioxide?
People will criticize Leonardo DiCaprio, who's made comments like, I'll fly around the world to fight global warming. They'll criticize Al Gore because of their carbon footprints and lifestyle. Yeah. Does that take away? Are they the best spokesmen?
My brother, that is such a...
That's the obligatory question.
Yeah, that's a question that you shouldn't be asking here today, because that defies the spirit of what this is about. So, anyone who attacks Leonardo DiCaprio is either a coward or an ideologue.
We'll look at how kids are being fed climate fears from a very young age.
Global warming. 30 years? That won't affect me.
Please help the world.
Like getting your dad to insulate the loft, or taking your next holiday by train instead of flying, or buying energy-saving light bulbs. Now, no pressure at all, but it'd be great to get a sense of how many of you might do this, just a rough percentage. That's fantastic! And those not. sleeping, Tracy? That's fine, that's absolutely fine. Your own choice. Okay, class, thank you so much for today. Oh, just before you go, I just need to press this little button here. Now, everybody, please remember to read chapters 5 and 6 on volcanoes and glaciation.
We will look at some of the, well, odd solutions to global warming.
Maybe things like hygiene, where we've now normalised showering every day, sometimes twice a day. That means we have to change our clothes every day.
They've called for, quote, radical and immediate degrowth strategies in the U.S.
We need, radical, almost overnight change.
The only way to stop runaway climate change is to terminate industrial civilization.
And some other solutions that are just plain terrifying.
You're not endorsing dismantling physically a violation of the law or any kind of eco-terrorism, are you?
It depends on the circumstances.
That's not out. It's a possibility.
Means necessary, we mean by any means necessary. We would support it.
I call this human engineering. And what it involves is the biomedical modification of human beings. We can make humans smaller. So reducing the average height in the U.S. by just 15 centimeters, for example, would mean a mass reduction of 23% for men and 25% for women, with a corresponding reduction of the metabolic weight of 15 to 18%.
Obviously, less people would exert less pressure on the natural resources.
And making fertility management ubiquitously available.
Because we are already exceeding the planetary carrying capacity.
Africa is projected to have more people than China or India by mid-century, more than China and India combined by the end of the century. And this is one of the causal factors that must be addressed.
We will reveal how new global warming-based energy restrictions are leading the world into energy poverty. And finally, we'll take a detailed look at how the so-called climate change solutions will not only impact the world's economic health, but will have devastating impacts on the world's poor who struggle to survive without running water or electricity.
There's over 1 billion people in this world with no electricity.
The effort to fight global warming by reducing CO2 emissions, by reducing our use of fossil fuels, harms the poor around the world more than anybody else. We're being asked to spend $50 billion a year to have no impact on global climate. That, I think, is unconscionable morally.
Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you for our next film. This is Mark Morano, and I hope you will start asking hard questions and examining the evidence about global warming fears for yourself.
The planet's warming, warming. That's what they'd have you believe. There's panic in the streets causing quite a sensation. A message being preached by the United Nations that the polar cap is melting like it's covered with salt. And then they'll all tell you it's America's fault. So all the so-called experts feel they should warn you. The temperature is higher in California. They say there's lots of global warming in every town. And if you believe the experts, then we're all gonna drown. But global warming is just a bunch of hot air. And I don't care.